right, so for this next section, what we're gonna do for our theme is we're gonna go ahead and add some styling together, okay? Now, styling in a Liferay theme is done a little bit differently than just traditional CSS, okay? We are using Scss or SCSS to accomplish our overall global styles, okay? Now, just like the Portal normal free marker file, being our HTML source file, we also have a source file for our SCSS, okay? Everything in our theme is ultimately read through what's called this main SCSS file, and it's going to be importing everything. But at the very, very bottom of that list, we have our custom.scss, okay? So for us, for our purposes of modifying our themes, the custom SCSS is going to be our main CSS source file that we'll be looking at here, okay? All right, and we can use the custom SCSS, we can use many of these other files that we'll be looking at here to modify things like the typeface, the margins, buttons. We can basically do whatever global styling we want in our theme, okay? All right, now the benefits of using Scss specifically in our themes is it gives us the ability to basically do a lot more with our CSS and be able to utilize some CSS3 styling as well. And Scss basically adds a preprocessor that will compile all of that for us so that we can write it and read it very easily without having to worry about whether or not it's going to work in any given browser, okay? Now, there are a number of features in Scss that we can take advantage of, okay? There are variables, okay? And variables, just like we can do in FreeMarker, allow us the ability to store and reuse code. Okay, so if we want to do, as we'll see here in a little bit, variables for the colors we'll use throughout the platform, we can go ahead and do that, making it much, much easier to add colors and maintain those colors in the theme, okay? We also have mixins, and mixins are groups of CSS declarations that can also be reused as well, okay? As we'll see in a little bit, there are actually some mixins that we have available to us already, and then we can add our own mixins within the theme as well. All right, we also have extending and inheritance available to us. And this also allows us to cut back lines of code by allowing us to write some code in one particular class and reuse that code through inheritance or extending. Okay, so this makes it a lot easier for us. And again, we'll see some examples of this when we are building our theme, okay? There is also nesting that allows developers to create hierarchies similar to HTML, and it can actually parallel the hierarchy in HTML, making it easier to understand and read, and also, again, cutting back lines of code for efficiency, okay? There are also operators. Just like we can do in FreeMarker, we can also use those operators in Scss as well. So there are a lot of things that you can do with Scss. For those of you who are interested in learning more about Scss, there's some pretty great documentation online. You can just go ahead and take a look at that to learn more. All right, so we have some examples here for some of the Scss features. Okay, so we have our variables, for example. One of the examples we look at here in our clay custom.scss file, we have some variables here for our different colors, like I mentioned. It's very easy to maintain a color scheme this way, as you just simply need to modify the variable, and then all of the variables used throughout the rest of the theme are going to be updated, okay? Now, it's important here to note that with SCSS, we're taking advantage of what are called partials, okay? Now, partials are gonna be the CSS files that start with our underscore, okay? And partials are not read on their own, okay? Partials must be imported elsewhere. But what this allows us to do is it allows us to be modular in how we add CSS, and it also allows us to modify the partials that comprise that clay base, okay? So we have all of those available to us through the build theme. If we want to modify some of those clay components, how they're actually designed, we can do that. There are a number of partials available to us that allow us to do that. And they will ultimately be read in a higher file. So in many cases, it's partial being read in, or partials, I should say, as a group being read in an individual partial that is ultimately read in a non-partial file, and that's what's gonna be compiled. In our case, like I mentioned, the ultimate file is gonna be that main SCSS that is not a partial file. But what we'll want to do is whenever we do some modifications, we'll want to make sure those are all being read in our custom.scss. Okay, and that's going to be a partial as well that again is ultimately read in main.scss. Okay, so the benefit of these partials is it allows us to break up our code. It allows us to focus specifically on components or various elements that we want to style, okay? Or in our case, the clay base would include some of those clay components, okay? And it allows us to have the ability to further maintain those different components and elements without having to worry about having a giant CSS file with all of the code in there, okay? So this is gonna be helpful for us as we continue on, okay? And that's why you'll see some of these files, such as the clay custom example here with an underscore in front. That is what that is. It's a partial file, okay, if you're not already familiar with that concept. All right. Like I said, there's also mixins that we can do. There are mixins that are used for CSS3 code. So for example, if you were just going to write semantic CSS or just regular CSS, okay, you may have to use some of those browser prefixes to make sure that CSS3 works on all of the browsers, okay? But we could simply create a mixin that does it for us. So this is an example, and there are a number of frameworks that already do this, and we'll talk about what we have available to us here, okay? But for example, if we wanted a border radius mixin for CSS3 border radius, we can create the mixin. We can use all of the OS-specific classes, and then we can just reuse the mixin throughout our theme, okay? There's an example of that there, okay? So like I said, for all of the common CSS3 features, okay, we do have a Bourbon mixin library available to us. Bourbon is what we can take advantage of within Liferay out of the box to basically run some of those CSS3 mixins. Okay, so it already has all of the mixins included. We can just use that out of the box, and we can create our own mixins for any other specific instance we might have in mind. Okay. All right, so keep that in mind, and we'll actually see some of those whenever you see CSS3 mixins being used. We're probably taking advantage of what Bourbon already provides for us, okay? And on top of that, the more you use Bourbon, the happier you get. Just kidding. That will depend on how you take your Bourbon. So there are other things here as well, like inheritance, nesting, operators, okay? Like I've mentioned, we can see some of these throughout our CSS as we continue on with creating or adding our styling, okay? All right, so as we mentioned, the custom SCSS partial is gonna be our main CSS source file. It's ultimately gonna be read in main CSS, okay? But just like I mentioned with the HTML files, it is best for developers to only include whatever partials they want to modify in the source CSS folder. Okay, so again, that's where all of our modifications are going to be. All right, so we're gonna follow that practice here as well. Okay, but again, we're gonna go ahead and look to our exercise source to get some of those base files that we can work with, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and add some SCSS files that we can modify. We're gonna start by setting some variables that we can use throughout the rest of our SCSS files, okay? So let's go ahead and do that together. Okay. All right, so go ahead and open up your theme source file. Okay, so we last ended in templates in the last video, so I'm gonna go ahead and come back to the Livingston Fjord theme source. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and open up my CSS folder here, and you'll see that there is already by default a custom.scss file there. Okay. So like I said, let's go ahead and get the default starting point files that we can go ahead and modify in our own theme through our exercises, okay? So make sure you have your exercises open. Okay, so I'm in exercise source here. I just came back up from the templates section, which is where we left off in the previous video. Okay. Open up CSS in the exercise source, okay? And here you will see there are a few top level files, and then otherwise we have everything organized in a partials folder, which I'll explain in a bit, and the Portlet folder. Okay. So go ahead and copy these. Come over to the CSS folder of our theme source and paste them in here, replacing the custom.scss. Okay. All right. So this gives us our starting point here. Next, we want to go ahead and add the variables like I've mentioned. Okay, so make sure you have your Visual Studio Code open. All right, you'll see I have some remaining files from the previous video, so I'm going to go ahead and close those out. Okay, and we're going to start by dragging the Clay custom SCSS into Visual Studio Code. Okay. All right, so this Clay custom file here is where developers can add the custom background variables. Okay, and this will give us our starting point here, and this will ultimately be imported into our different files. So this will be imported into the actual imports SCSS, okay? And we'll see that a little bit later on. So let's go ahead and highlight the comment here, just like we did before. Do LFR, okay? And go ahead and select that first snippet, okay? All right, so this is similar to what we talked about a little bit earlier with variables. Okay, this sets our color variables for body, bright colors, complementary, okay, dark, light, solid, etc. And it sets the different colors here, as well as our border for the Portlet decorate, which we'll get to in a little bit. Okay. All right, so this gives us a good starting point for some variables. All right, but we want to also add some more generalized variables for our colors. Okay. And in order to keep things more modular, again, in our own theme, we have some additional folders here. So let me just talk about these folders real quick. Okay. You will see if you go to the build folder, which includes the base theme, that there are a number of folders that keep things organized and more modular. Okay. What we've done is we've taken a number of partials that we want to work with. And again, these are just going to be specific elements or specific Clay components, such as buttons, for example. And we've just added them into the partials folder. Okay. And we've made it even more modular by having a variables folder that includes buttons and colors. Okay. And as you can imagine, these partials will be imported into the variables.scss. Okay. And this will ultimately be brought into our custom SCSS, which will ultimately be read in our main.scss, which will be read when we deploy. Okay. All right, so that's the partials folder, which we'll be looking at first. And then we have the Portlet folder. Okay. Now the Portlet folder is a little bit different. This does actually come straight from the base theme. Okay. In the base theme, the Portlet folder includes a number of SCSS files for Portlet styling, okay, or widget styling. All right, we're gonna pretty much be using those terms synonymously at this point. Okay, so we'll come back to this in a little bit. Let's go ahead and start by opening partials and opening variables if you haven't already done this with me. Okay, and I'm gonna go ahead and bring the colors.scss into my Visual Studio Code. Okay. All right, just like we did before, I'm going to go ahead and add in the snippet for the colors SCSS, which is going to be 02. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save this file here. And again, this just gives us some simple variables that we can work with. So background colors and regular colors. Okay, and we can use these throughout our different files as well. Okay. All right, we're gonna go ahead and also include a variable for our button padding. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up our CSS source here. Again, I'm still in variables where I will see the buttons.scss. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and add that here. All right, we can actually go ahead and type this one out together. Okay, we're gonna do a little bit of mix of snippets and typing as we continue throughout these videos. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and just as an example of the variables, add the $sign, and we're going to call this variable button dash padding. Okay, so make sure we have that there. All right, and we're going to add some simple padding here, so we'll do 19 pixels by 48. Okay, and add the semicolon at the end, of course. And look at that. We have a button padding variable for our buttons. Okay, so nice and easy. This is just a quick example of how you can add some of those variables. Okay. All right. And then what we want to do is we want to make sure that we are importing all of our variables here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close the Clay custom. We want to go ahead and import colors and buttons into our variables SCSS partial. Okay, again, this just keeps things modular. And as I open this up here, if I wanted to add more individual variables, okay, it would be good for me to continue to create partials files here that I can import into variables SCSS, again, allowing me better maintenance in the future. Okay, so instead of having a massive variables SCSS, okay, if I want to just update the base colors, if I want to just update the buttons, I can go ahead and just go into their individual partial file. Okay. All right, so go ahead and open up the variables SCSS. That's going to be found in the partials folder. Okay. All right, and we're just going to do some simple imports. Okay, so let's go ahead and type out the imports. Okay, it's going to be the @ import. Okay, and then do our quotations, and then we'll do variables / buttons, semicolon at the end. Okay, so importing that first, and then we're going to do the same thing for colors. Okay, import variables colors, and we can go ahead and hit save. Okay. All right, there is an optional snippet for this as well if you'd rather just use the snippet. Okay, you can just type LFR and then select the 04 optional. Okay. All right, so we now have some variables for our colors, for our buttons. We've imported them into the variables.scss, and we'll go ahead and import this later as well into our custom. So I'm going to go ahead and close these files. Okay, nice and easy. All right, and now I want to make sure that I have my portlet variables customized as well. So this will give us the sort of variable foundation, if you will, for the rest of our SCSS. Okay, so go ahead and close partials. Okay, and open up the portlet folder. All right, and you'll see variable custom.scss here. So go ahead and drag that into our Visual Studio Code here. Okay, and let's go ahead and highlight the comment rather. Okay, type LFR, and then find the 5th snippet. It'll be called 05 Portlet Variables Custom SCSS. Okay, and enter that in here. All right, so these variables will be used later for some of our Portlet CSS. Okay, so we have things like some borders. All right, we're using border radius as well as some colors, okay, and some margins. All right. Okay, so now that we have all of our variables set for us, now what we can do is we can go ahead and add some styling for the other aspects of our pages that we modified in the HTML, as well as adding some custom SCSS. So let's go ahead and open up our theme source here again. Okay, so again, we're in source CSS. Okay, let's start by adding some styling to our footer. Okay, so we added our footer. We added some IDs and classes to our footer. Okay, so this will be found in the partials folder. We can go ahead and drag the footer SCSS into the editor. Okay. All right, go ahead and highlight over this, and we're going to type LFR and find that 6th snippet here. Okay. And here, what you'll see is we are styling the different IDs that we've added in our footer. Okay? And we're taking advantage of some of our variables. Okay? We're also setting some specific colors here as well. So again, that's something that you can do in individual instances, but it does make it easier for us to take advantage of some of those variables. Okay. All right, you'll also see that there are some media query variables being used here. Okay. And we can use those out of the box with these variables for the different breakpoints. Okay. All right, so we can go ahead and save that. And now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and import these different partials that we've modified into our custom.scss. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do those imports together. So go ahead and open up the Finder. Okay, open up the custom SCSS. All right, and we're going to go ahead and type in some of our imports. Okay, just like we did before, get some more import experience going on here. All right. Okay, so go ahead and do that with me. So first, I'm going to go ahead and import the variables file from our partials. Again, that's going to be already importing some of our other files there. So we're doing that modular imports. Okay, so partials / variables. Okay, we're going to do about 5 of these together. Okay, so if you want, you can actually do this with me. I'm just going to go ahead and set it up, making it easier for me. Okay. All right. So then for the next one, I'm going to do the portlet decorator. Going to be in the portlet folder / portlet decorator. Okay. All right, now we'll come back to that file a little bit later on. We'll talk about portlet decorators in the video for configuring our theme. Okay, and then for these next ones, we've already seen these. Okay, so let's do partials, buttons, partials, footer. Oops. And partials, nav bar. Not mav bar, nav bar. There you go. Okay. All right, so this gives us the import into our custom SCSS. Okay. Again, all of our partials that we are modifying should be imported here, and then our global SCSS changes can go in here as well. Okay, so that's what we're going to go ahead and add next, are the global custom SCSS changes. Okay. So once you've typed all of our imports, okay, go ahead and come to the snippet comment here for 08. Type LFR. Okay, and select the 08 custom SCSS. Then you can go ahead and save the file. All right, and what this will do for us is it will give us some styling for our different IDs and classes. Okay, obviously, you'll see some of our variables being used throughout here. Okay, and you'll also see some of our Scss nesting as well. Okay, so Jumbotron, for example, and we'll be taking advantage of some of these class changes a little bit later on. Okay, image spacing, H1, etc., etc. Okay, you'll see here too for classes created for our different background colors, we're just taking advantage of those variables again. This makes it much, much easier in the future to modify the color palette if needed. Okay, all right, we have some background image styling. Okay, and we have some media queries being used here as well. So this gives us our responsive design. Okay, so it's pretty straightforward. Feel free to look around in this particular file here. Okay, but this gives us our base custom SCSS. Okay. All right, so we just opened a bunch of files here and added some styling, but let me sort of recap what we've done. Okay, we have added our files here. And again, for the full build process, you would be getting these files from the build folder, that is the base theme, okay? And modifying whatever it is you'd like, okay? We have here our partials being organized. And then again, we have some modularity here with our variables. We can add new variables filed if we'd like. And then we import them into variables and ultimately into the custom Scss, okay? We've modified some of the base portlet styling here by modifying the variables from the base theme, okay? And then we've added our custom Scss through the custom Scss folder, which will ultimately be read in that main CSS folder that will be deployed when we run gulp deploy, okay? There are some other files here. You can go ahead and open these as well and take a look. So for example, in imports is where we are getting our clay custom. That's what we modified first for our variables. That's being imported here. It's also where we get our bourbons and our mix-ins, okay? And then we're getting some Atlas variables for clay. Okay, if you're not familiar with Atlas, by the way, just as a side note, Atlas is essentially a set of styles that can get us a little bit closer to what we're using in the classic theme, okay? So feel free to dig into that as well, but we are just referencing those by default, okay? But this will give you an idea of the kinds of things that you'll need to do to make your modifications, okay? We're obviously working on the Fjord theme here, so some of this stuff is already done for us, but working with partials, keeping things modular, and putting everything in our custom Scss is what you guys need to know to add and modify your CSS in your theme, right? All right, now before we do a gulp deploy and wrap up this video, we're gonna add one more thing that's necessary for our styles, and that's gonna be our images, okay? So let's go ahead and in our Livingston Fjord theme source, come back to the main section here. So this is where our CSS folder is, templates, images, JS, etc. Okay. And then in our exercises, we're gonna find some images and place them in the images folder, okay? So come out of the CSS section and back to the exercise source. Open up images, okay? And you'll see we have some screenshots and thumbnails for the GUI so that it will show an example of what our theme will look like, as well as a favicon. You can add favicon ICO files to the images folder in your theme, and that will change the favicon that shows up in your tabs on your browser or in your apps or different things like that. Okay, so go ahead and copy these. Come back to source, images, and just simply paste them on in there. Okay. All right, so this gives us a good starting point for our styles. So go ahead and open up your terminal or command line again. Make sure you are in the Livingston Fjord theme and go ahead and run a gulp deploy. Okay. If you are running gulp watch, some of these changes should already been applied. If you can just go ahead and take a look at the browser to see if they did actually apply. Okay. So we ran gulp deploy. Last step here, we can go ahead and open up Google, okay, or whatever browser you're using. I'm using Google Chrome. All right, so this gives us my base for my styling. You'll see, just like we did in the Portal Normal, okay, we have the sign in link at the bottom left. So I'm gonna go ahead and click on that, just make sure I can sign in. Okay, sign as Josiah, test, and there we go. Okay. All right, and if I want to test some of my responsive design as it stands right now, Liferay does have a built-in simulation menu at the top right here. You can go ahead and click on that, okay? Or to click on mobile, for example, close this, okay? All right, there's still some things I need to do, but you will see those icons for the menu that we talked about earlier. Okay, you can see a little bit easier here. All right. So things are looking good so far. The next thing we're gonna do in the next video is we're gonna add some custom JavaScript, okay? So thanks for sticking around. We now have our HTML and our CSS. When we come back, we'll go ahead and add some of that JavaScript.